All right, so we are back and we are ready to continue talking about U.S. history. This topic is topic 4, chapter 4. It's America Comes of Age. So, the idea behind this chapter is that we are moving forward from sort of Reconstruction, settling the West, what's going on in the United States during the Industrial Age, and moving into other issues. We are ultimately going to be building up to World War One, the Great Depression, and so forth. But for now, we are looking at what these transition years look like. As usual, I've included vocabulary here. Whenever you see one of these terms, pay extra close attention. Everyone from the muckrakers and Jacob Riis, whose images we looked at previously, to the idea of suffrage, Teddy Roosevelt and the Square Deal, the Meat Inspection Act, the Niagara Movement. We'll be talking about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois for a second time. So make sure that you know these terms as well as the ones on this slide. New Nationalism, Woodrow Wilson, the William Howard Taft, the concept of spheres of influence, big stick diplomacy versus dollar and moral diplomacy. So all terms that we should be familiar with. And then these are just a few of the things we should be able to do or do during our conversations for this topic. Identify the causes of progressivism, and then can you compare progressivism to populism? And remember, when we talk about comparisons, we're talking about things that are the same as well as things that are different. Analyze the role that journalists and novelists played in the progressive movement. Evaluate some of the social reforms that progressives tackled. Examine the actions taken by various groups to expand their rights. We're going to be talking about African Americans, women, Native Americans. How did Teddy Roosevelt influence the changing relationship between the federal government and private business? So we'll be talking about trust busting, for example. Explain the impact of Roosevelt's actions towards managing the environment. We'll be talking about conservation and preservation. Compare and contrast Roosevelt's policies with Taft's policies and Wilson's policies, all three important presidents of the progressive era, and all three considered to be progressive presidents. Describe Wilson's efforts to regulate the economy and assess the legacy of the progressive era, and then identify the key factors that caused Americans want to take a greater role overseas. So this idea of paying more attention to what's going on outside of America's borders. So where are we? Well, we've talked about industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. And all three of these things bring benefits to the U.S., but they also produce challenging social problems. In response, a movement called progressivism emerged in the 1890s. Progressives believed that new ideas and honest, efficient government could bring about social justice. Progressive ideas brought lasting reforms that still affect society today. So a lot of union issues make progress during this time period. You know, why can't you get a job when you're 12? All of that happens in the progressive era. And of course, women can finally vote in the progressive era. This is a picture of a Salvation Army volunteer. So, the roots of progressivism or the rise of progressivism. Do you guys remember this political cartoon? Hopefully, you do from a previous topic. You can see where it says the protectors of our industries, and you see the backs of the workers literally supporting these bags of money, right? They're men on top. They're these industry leaders, these robber barons, if you will, but they are actually bags of money. If you look at their collar, it's the top of the bag. And then the dollar sign on their big belly there. And they're sitting on top of millions, right? Fields millions, Gould's millions, Vanderbilt's millions. And all of that is perched on things like linens, where it says linen workers make an average of $11 per week. Cloth workers, $9 per week. Iron workers, $7 per week. Lumber workers, $6 per week, and on and on. You have leather workers, paper workers. So what is their money being built on the backs of? You have the hammer and sickle down there floating in the water, and the water is labeled with the words hard times. Who are these hard times for? Is there an appeal to something other than democracy? Can democracy rise to these challenges? And these are going to be questions that we're going to ask really in this class from now until Christmas and even beyond. Well, let me go back, hang on. So progressivism is this idea of a movement, right? There's not one progressive party. We're going to have Democratic progressive presidents as well as Republican progressive presidents. So today we say, are they a progressive? And that tends to mean they're further left. But in this time period, it's a general movement, a response to problems of the industrial age. So progressive presidents are trying, or progressive politicians, members of the progressive movement during this time period, are simply trying to respond to the needs of workers. Not always at the expense of industrialists, but certainly in some ways respond to the needs of the worker. So who are progressives? Well, progressives are going to ask the question, can the free market address problems that came with the industrial age? Do you remember the idea of laissez-faire? Government is going to be completely hands off of the market economy. The market will regulate itself. Well, is that true? And think back to that cartoon. What about that hammer and sickle, right? If we are concerned about democracy handling the problems of the worker, the problems of the industrial age, then perhaps we need to make some changes to how our democracy functions. And one of those changes could potentially be government taking a more active role in the economy, regulating big business, making sure that workers are paid a certain wage. And again, progressivism is not a political party, right? You have progressives on both sides of the political spectrum here. It's just this idea that there is a need for government to fix society, but that government, the way it is now, can't fix society. So perhaps progressives argue we need to fix government so that government can fix society. If you are a progressive, you tended to be urban, you tended to be educated, and you tended to be middle class. But again, it's Republicans as well as Democrats. You have faith in science, you have faith in technology. These are just kind of the progressive personality. The definition of progressivism, as it says in the bottom right, is the name given to American reformers during the late 19th and early 20th century. These reformers wanted to fix the political, economic, social problems in America, as well as improve American society. And here's that cartoon for a second time. So what are progressives going to believe? We'll start at the top. That businesses should be regulated, that no business should be allowed total free reign, right? Because the free market is unable to fix social problems. There's this belief, well, workers will get paid more as prices go up. Well, it's not working, and workers are paid less and less. You saw that last slide. Some workers are being paid $6 a week. That's not sustainable, and that's not what is going to fix problems in urban America specifically. That government does play a role in addressing social problems. Remember a couple topics ago, we talked about social Darwinism, this idea that you're applying laws of evolution to human society, that maybe the poor are poor because it's a culling, so to speak. It's a really horrible idea. But progressives are going to take the opposite stance here and say, no, it's not just natural human evolution to weed out those who are poor and allow them to starve to death, that government should be doing something to address social problems. So whether it's making sure little kids aren't working in factories, or it's making sure that workers are only required to work a certain number of hours per week, things like that government does play a role in addressing social problems. Now, there is disagreement within the progressive movement about how much of a role government should play, but it's agreed upon that there is some role for government here. They also believe that industrialization and urbanization created social problems. That yes, industry is great. Again, remember, they have faith in science and technology, but it results in a lot of problems that need to be cleaned up. They believe government is corrupt and that government needs to be reformed. And there have been a lot of examples of government and the problems of government. Think about Harding and his corrupt administration. So the government should be reformed. They believe in scientific principles, and they believe in using those scientific principles to fix society. So a lot going on here with progressives. You can even think about where you might fall in terms of this little chart of progressive beliefs, if you agree, disagree, etc. Now, populism and progressivism are two different things. Remember we talked about populism in the last topic when we were talking about like the Grangers, those farmers, and this idea of like a gold standard and things like that, being against the gold standard. Progressives and populists are different, and this chart is really useful for explaining that difference. So progressives are guided by education, modern ideas, and scientific techniques. Whereas populists are going to believe that the ideal community revolved around simple village life. And remember, at the core, populists were farmers. Now, they're trying to appeal to people who work in urban areas as well, but this is going to be part of the appeal, that true sort of ideal American life is a small, simple village life. So let's go back to the progressives. Guided by education, modern ideas, and scientific techniques, they believe in a modern, educated, and uniform culture. Now, this is important. This idea of immigration is going to come into play here, that there is a need to assimilate, that we need to have this Americanized society, and that there's one definition of what American is, and that, yes, we are a nation of immigrants, but in the end, we're going to be a uniform culture. Progressives are going to be mostly white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, middle class. And they oftentimes worked to rewrite state constitutions to include things like voter registration laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses, all of which we talked about in Reconstruction. And it goes back to that second bullet point, that in order for citizens to be informed voters, they needed to prove that they were educated voters, that they needed to have some experience with voting. So there is a little bit a lot of elitism that's going to be rolled into these progressive ideas. Populists are going to believe, as I said, that the ideal community revolves around the simple village life. They're going to be mostly working class farmers and factory workers. They're going to protest a lack of access to money and to credit, and they're going to be opposed to the gold standard. And I think this is really interesting because progressives a lot of times say things like, working conditions are horrible for the factory worker. And so they're saying, vote for us, elect us, support our viewpoint because we're for the working man. But most of the working man were populists, right? They didn't necessarily completely agree with the progressive agenda. And there's a real disconnect there. And I would argue that even today, a lot of times there is a disconnect, right? Between what sort of more elite politicians are arguing is best for the working class and the farmers, and what the working class and the farmers are actually supporting are often different things. So something to keep in mind, this sort of tension that we see here and that we just see repeated over and over again. But there are some things where they do share common interests, and that's in the middle there in the green. They both desire social, economic, environmental, and political reforms. So they all agree something needs to change. They may disagree on what. They both try to eliminate abuses of big business. They both dislike banks, big businesses, especially the farmers. Remember their issue with the railroads and then the trusts or the monopolies. They oppose systemic barriers to small ownership. So they believe in sort of the idea of what we would today say small businesses. For them, they would say small businesses, but also small farms as opposed to large farms. And key leaders for both groups are advocates of white supremacy. For the progressive, it's this idea of a uniform culture. For the populist, it's this idea of immigrants stealing our jobs, right? And African Americans stealing our jobs. That's sort of the refrain that you hear from them. So some commonalities, but several differences as well. So the muckrakers are going to be a really important component of the progressive reform movement. Muckrakers are socially conscious journalists, as it says. They could be authors of newspaper articles, or they could be authors of long books. They could be photographers. So they're journalists, they're writers, they're photographers, and they worked very hard on investigative reports. So this is the era of the investigative journalist, right? Where they would go like undercover and expose the working conditions or the living conditions or whatever conditions that they were trying to expose. And they would help progressives because they would publish these stories, for example, in the newspaper, and they would start turning public opinion in the way that they wanted it to go. So if they were trying to expose the living conditions, think about those Jacob Riis photographs that I had you look at. If they wanted the American public to understand that, a lot of these urban workers were living in squalor, sort of stacked on top of each other in a lot of ways. So that is something that they might publish, and then the American people will go, oh, that's so horrible, and then start to support progressive ideas in housing reform, if you followed what I just said. So they would expose this. Now, a muck rake is a tool that was used to clean manure and hay out of stables. And so that's sort of why they were called muckrakers. It was a term that Roosevelt used to sort of make fun of them, like you're always stirring stuff up, you're always raking the muck. And journalists in time came to embrace it. This is Nellie Bly. She is one such muckraker who is a very important female muckraker of this time period. And that's something else to keep in mind, is that there are a lot of female journalists who are going to be very actively exposing what's going on. But until sort of the middle of the progressive era, women don't have the right to vote. Okay. Let's see if there's anything. Oh, Nellie Bly. She went undercover in a mental institution, pretended to be insane, got herself committed, had difficulty getting herself back out, and then wrote this big expose about the conditions of mental health facilities at the time, which were really atrocious. So, they really did put themselves at risk to uncover this muck. Right. So here are a few more. And again, muckrakers are investigative journalists interested in political corruption, should say, conditions of early life. So here are a few. You have Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, Upton Sinclair, and Jacob Riis. So Ida Tarbell is going to work to expose the unfair practices of large corporations. She writes something called The History of the Standard Oil Company, where she exposes a lot of the abuses of Standard Oil, which, if you remember, was Carnegie's company. And I've included some quotes here that are well-known quotes from each of these muckrakers. So for Ida Tarbell, she says, if it has taught us anything, it is that our present lawmakers are, as a body, so as a group, are ignorant, corrupt, and unprincipled, that the majority of them are, directly or indirectly, under the control of the very monopolies against whose acts we have been seeking relief. This is so interesting because we really do see a lot of these same attacks leveled against politicians today. She's saying, these politicians are in bed with big business, that they are accepting money from lobbyists, and that's a common refrain that you hear even now. So Ida Tarbell. Lincoln Steffens is another important muckraker exposing political corruption, including political machines. And if you remember Boss Tweed, and his text that we associate in Tammany Hall with Boss Tweed. But for Lincoln Steffens, his text we associate with him is Shame of the Cities. And he says, care like hell. Sit around the bars and drink and pose and pretend all you want to. But in reality, deep down underneath, care like hell. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which, if you've heard of any of these guys, you've probably heard before this class, you've probably heard of Upton Sinclair and The Jungle, where he wrote some really horrific things that he found while touring meatpacking plants in Chicago. He said that they use everything about the hog except the squeal. And I excluded some of the more colorful descriptions that he uses. But it's really his book, The Jungle, that leads to the passage of laws like the Meat Inspection Act, where, meat production factories, meatpacking plants have to, be inspected and pass inspection, because that was not the case before. So you can imagine what people were eating. Jacob Riis, in his book, How the Other Half Lives, where he exposes the living conditions of people in urban areas during the industrial age. And we looked at his pictures in the last topic. Oh, whoops, I'm sorry. I included another Upton Sinclair quote. One of the necessary accompaniments of capitalism in a democracy is political corruption. And reflect on whether or not you think that's true. But Jacob Riis said, "Oh God, that bread should be so dear, and flesh and blood so cheap." really lamenting the conditions that a lot of these workers found themselves in. So all of these muckrakers are going to have the goal of reforming the government, but there is a lot of diversity of opinion and approach in how they did that. There's a lot of feeling also during this time period that government should be doing more to help the urban poor, but also individual people should be doing more to help the urban poor. You have the social gospel movement, which is a movement that pushed Christian leaders to work towards social reform, basically saying that it was wrong for Christians to turn a blind eye to the suffering of their fellow man. So you see movements like religious groups like the Salvation Army, which is a religious denomination, the YMCA, the settlement house movement. Settlement houses were like boarding houses where you could go and stay if you couldn't afford better living conditions. Jane Addams is probably the most well-known founder of this settlement house movement, and this is a picture of her Hull House in Chicago, where she would work to, help educate the little kids who lived there and watch them while their parents worked and that kind of thing. So settlement houses were a source of great support for many people living in urban areas. Public education sees a renewed interest here because there is a need to do two things. One is train this new industrial workforce. We have these new factories, but not everybody knows how to use this new technology. Again, a refrain that we're hearing continued even today. And there's also a need to do something called Americanize immigrants, that immigrants coming in need to be taught the history of America and sort of how to be American. You have greater access to public education in cities, and African Americans, regardless of where they live, are often denied access. And remember Booker T. Washington and his big push to bring African Americans into the public education system. Up here in the top left, there's a lot of pushback against this idea of social Darwinism from people like Lester Frank Ward, for example, where he says you cannot use Darwin's ideas of evolution on human society because he says humans are different from animals. We can actually change things. History is not inevitable. Poverty is not inevitable. Humans have the ability to make plans for the future, and we have the ability to change outcomes. And so to do nothing here is wrong. Edward Bellamy writes a text called Looking Backward, where he advocates that maybe, or he suggests that perhaps democracy is not equipped to solve these problems, that maybe there needs to be a turn to socialism. And you also see ideas like this repeated in literature. It's a genre that's going to become popular during this time period called naturalism. People like Jack London, you've read like Call of the Wild, where he's writing to show that sometimes our circumstances are beyond our control, that it's nothing within our DNA that's making us poor, that it could be our circumstances. And those circumstances can be changed, like people like Lester Frank Ward were arguing. Walter Rauschenbusch, I'm sure I mispronounced that. He is going to be a leading proponent of this social gospel movement, and he will publish in 1907 Christianity and the Social Crisis. So what is our obligation to our fellow man as Christians? He asks. Improvements for children in the Progressive Era. Children enrolled in public schools in the age of 5 to 17 is in blue. Children employed, the age of 10 to 15. So you can see education is increasing and employed children is decreasing. 10 to 15, y'all. Like that's just, I don't know. How old do you have to be to work at Chick-fil-A? It's pretty young, right? 15, 16? I don't know. Maybe it's not. But there's even limits on the number of hours that kids could work, even if they are allowed to work. So things are improving for children, although it does take some time. 30 years is a long time. Reforming society. Social welfare progressives create charities and seek to change laws. One of the issues that they're going to shed a light on is child labor. There's another muckraker named John Spargo. His picture's down there in the bottom right. And in 1906, he writes The Bitter Cry of the Children, where he exposed through images, through pictures, horrible working conditions of so-called breaker boys who would go in and sort of prepare the miners to be able to come in and access the material. Really dangerous, dirty work you can see from the images there in the bottom. And because of these child labor sort of exposés. That picture in the center and the little boy's eyes are just really striking to me. States do begin to pass some laws. There are going to be minimum employment age laws, that little kids can only work a certain amount of hours per week, and that it can't interfere with their education. Like, you can't be 6 years old and working in a factory and not going to school. So there are going to be some reforms here. They start at the state level before you see them at the federal level. You also see some progressive success in terms of health and safety codes. Progressives will work towards laws that improve working conditions and the treatment of workers. For example, compensation laws, meaning that there's going to be insurance funds that are paid for by the employer that would pay you if you got hurt on the job. So workman's comp is what we would refer to that as. But there's still a question. Does the government have the power to mandate things like that? Because remember, that makes sense to us now, but at the time, there were real open questions about whether or not it was okay for the government to do things like tell people, hey, you need to make sure that you take care of your employees with workman's comp, access. That's new. Does the government have the authority to do that, or is that overstepping the authority of the government? So there are a couple of court cases that will confirm that the government does. Lochner v. New York in 1905 tells us that the state does have the right to interfere with the liberty of employers and employees. And Mueller v. Oregon in 1908 also affirms the state's right to limit working hours. There are some issues in Mueller v. Oregon where they're saying, women shouldn't work as long as men because they sort of need to go home. But it does affirm that states do have the right to limit working hours. In 1911, there is a huge upswell in favor of workers' safety and the establishment of something called the Factory Investigating Commission in New York, because of something called the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which is really horrific event that I'll play a little video clip on in a second. And then zoning laws and health codes will also become important. Like, you can't live on top of a factory. It's not healthy for you. And there are going to be some things that come out around that issue. A good political cartoon, you see labor. It says the level playing field. Labor's down there at the bottom with their sort of pitchforks, right? Corporations are up there at the top in their castle, being shielded by existing laws, the Contract Clause, the Commerce Clause, National Labor Relations Act. So what is government going to do to try to, quote unquote, level that playing field?
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was a man-made disaster, a tragedy of the industrial age, made all the worse because it could have been prevented. Let me set the scene. New York City, early 20th century. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied several floors of a Manhattan business building called the Ash Building. It was located just off Washington Square Park, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was, by almost any definition, a sweatshop. It was a densely packed place. Some 500 people worked there, and the work schedule was punishing. 11 to 12 hours a day, every day. Most of the people employed at the factory were young immigrant women, teenagers even, who didn't speak English. These women sat at long tables, day in, day out, sewing shirtwaists. Shirtwaists were mass-produced blouses. They resembled men's shirts and were very popular with working women. So here's what happened. March 25th, 1911, Saturday evening, the end of the workday, the work week. A fire started in a bin of cotton scraps, perhaps from a cigarette butt. A manager tried to use a hose to put it out, but the hose valve was rusted shut, and the hose itself was rotted away. The factory floor didn't have a sprinkler system, so the fire spread quickly. People panicked. The building had only one flimsy fire escape, and it wasn't nearly big enough. It collapsed. The building had 4 elevators, but only one was working, and it only held 12 people at a time. It managed to make 4 rescue trips before it broke down. Some desperate workers jumped to their deaths down the elevator shaft. Workers tried to take the stairs, but the exit doors only opened inward, and they were kept locked by factory management. Many people were crushed to death trying to get out. Firefighting technology hadn't caught up to the new tall buildings of a city like New York. The fire hoses and ladders could only reach the 7th floor, 1 floor short of the fire. Dozens of desperate workers jumped out of the windows. They chose to die from the fall instead of the flames. Other workers burned to death or died from smoke inhalation. The whole episode lasted just 18 minutes. 144 people were dead. 2 more died later in the hospital, bringing the death toll to 146. Until the events of September 11th, it was the deadliest workplace disaster in New York City history. Days later, on April 5th, a massive funeral protest march took place on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. More than 350,000 people were in attendance. The factory owners, Max Planck and Isaac Harris, were indicted for manslaughter, but were declared not guilty in their trial later that year. Yet, long after the flames died out, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire served as a cautionary tale that helped to redefine the American industrial workplace. The fire was a key moment in the growth of labor unions, particularly the ILGWU, or International Ladies Garment Workers Union. New York City passed measures including the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which required sprinkler systems to be installed in all factories. It served as a model for state and national workplace safety codes. These measures made American workers safer, but they were too late for the workers who perished one terrible March day at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
Okay, so sometimes it does take these sort of tragic events to bring the need for change to light. The Wilson year. So we're going to be kind of going back and forth to presidents during this conversation. Wilson is going to be another president who's going to work, be a progressive president and work toward the progressive agenda. One of the ways he'll do that is by regulating big business. And in 1918, you see the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act, where it's going to be illegal to employ children of under the age of 17. And there was some, question about whether or not this was constitutional. Ultimately, it was declared unconstitutional. Anyway, the government will eventually be able to regulate the child labor age, but it will take some time. The Adamson Act is going to be a law that results in an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. The Federal Farm Loan Act will result in low interest loans for farmers. Progressive reformers seek to reform the political process as well in order to reform society. They want to free government from the control of political bosses and powerful business interests. They want to give people more control over their government, as well as make government more effective and efficient at serving the public. The 17th Amendment is an example of this. Prior to the 17th Amendment, U.S. senators are going to be elected by state legislatures, not the people. After the 17th Amendment, senators are chosen by the voters in the states by direct election. So it's why you go and you vote for Senate instead of allowing the state legislature to do that for you. There are also some other state election reforms: the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. It's going to be important for you to know all of these things. An initiative is when it says that voters can petition to place a constitutional amendment on the ballot. If they get a certain number of signatures, then whatever they want gets on the ballot. A referendum, voters can petition to repeal an existing law. Or a recall, voters can remove elected representatives without waiting for the next election. Again, you have to have a certain number of petition signatures to do these 3 things, but they allow the American people more of a sort of check on political power in the United States. Progressives see inefficiencies in government. They view them as a source of some of society's problems, and so they're going to seek to correct the perceived corruption and inefficiencies that they see, not just in the federal government, but locally at the city level as well. The city or this commission plan is an example of one idea. A council manager system is an example of another idea. Essentially, though, both of them are going to allow for trained professionals to serve in different positions as opposed to political appointees. This is also going to be a slide that discusses things like the direct primary and the secret ballot, the 17th Amendment, initiative, referendum, and recall. Wisconsin is going to be the first to adopt this system, which is discussed at the top of the slide. Sorry, I'm blanking on these last few slides, where it says delegates used to be controlled by party bosses, and they would be the ones who nominated political candidates. Wisconsin will be the first to allow voters to choose which candidates are nominated, which again is why you go and you're able to vote in a political primary instead of Democrats telling you, here is our candidate, or Republicans saying, here is our candidate. You have a choice of candidates, at least in the beginning. We will continue this conversation of America Comes of Age shortly.